obituary. That's it. Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to the September 28th, 2017 Delaware Public Service Commission meeting. We have the reading of the meeting minutes of September 14th, both public and executive session. Any commissioner have any corrections or changes to the minutes, proposed minutes?
Move we adopt both the regular and the executives. You want them separate?
No, regular.
Regular and executive session minutes as presented. Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion to approve those minutes? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Consent agenda. Anybody want to have one of the items taken off, or are we okay with the consent agenda?
Move we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Second.
Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. Regular agenda. Number one, in the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light Company for approval of modifications to its gas cost rates. That's the first time I see you be so shy about coming forward.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was paying attention to another order I was looking at. As you know, this is an annual filing we do to just adjust our supply portion of our bill in gas for any changes that are incurred in essentially the market, of gas, or when there's an over or under recovery from a prior year based upon us selling more or less fuel than was expected, and it's a pass-through of the cost. There's no markup to it for a profit. And this year there is a slight increase in the supply rate, and this would just be what we do every year, which is asking you to open the docket, and that way we can send out public notice for comment sessions and the public notice of the proceedings. Both the public notice and the form of order have been agreed upon by the parties, and we ask that if it's acceptable to you, you would enter it today.
Thank you, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Willard.
Yes, as Mr. Goodman said, this is a regular thing with different charges for different classifications of customers. I believe it says the effect would be an increase in rates of about $4.40 during the winter months.
Yes, during the winter months. Yes.
And the staff agrees that the Order 9122 should be approved by the Commission.
Thank you, Mr. Willard. Mr. Slater.
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. The DPA has no objection.
Thank you, sir. Any commissioners have any questions?
Move we adopt order number 9122.
Any discussion on the motion to approve the order? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Goodman.
Thank you.
Number two is also you, I guess, Mr. Goodman, in the matter of the application of Delmarva Power and Light.
Yes, and this is a second annual filing that we do. This is another cost that is a pass-through. It can change year to year depending on the actual cost. There is no return or anything of that nature. And this dates back to the era when the cities used to light the streets with gas. And the gas had to be manufactured back then through coal. And it's really just the cleanups of those facilities. And now when you drive past the booming Christina River District in Wilmington, that's that land. So it's been put to fantastic use. And once again, we have an agreed-upon order, and we ask that if it's acceptable to the Commission, you enter this order simply opening this annual docket and allowing us to put public notice out.
Thanks, Mr. Goodman. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Chair Winslow and Commissioners. As Mr. Goodman stated, this is an opening order. We reviewed this, circulated it to Delmarva and the Division of the Public Advocate, and we believe the Exhibit A attached there too provides all the proper notice to the necessary parties and sets forth the pertinent dates. And we believe that everything is in It's both the statute and the previous docket and order number 6401, and we would ask that the Commission approve it as submitted.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Mr. Slater?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The DPA has no objection.
Thank you. Commissioners, questions? Motion?
Mr. Chair, I'll move that the Commission adopt order number 9123 as submitted.
I second it.
Any discussion on the motion?
One small question administratively on the Exhibit A public notice. I assume someone will drop the appropriate order number in place, yes?
It's actually already in there, Your Honor, and the moment I get, I'm not presuming, but if we're lucky enough for you to approve this order, I will immediately text my office in Wilmington, and they'll get these sent out for publication to the News Journal.
Okay, thank you. No further questions, Mr. Chair.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Goodman.
Thank you.
There's nothing on our hearing schedule today. Is there anyone here from the public that would?
We have
Oh, we have Mr. Chesapeake. Mr. O'Brien's looking at me like, what are you doing, Chairman? Not us. Sorry, Mr. O'Brien.
Not at all, sir.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. William O'Brien on behalf of Chesapeake Utilities Corporation. What you have before you is proposed order number 9119 in PSC docket number 17-1021. It also is an opening order for our annual adjustment to the GSR, or gas sales rate. Delmarva Power, as you just heard, calls their supply rate a GCR, or gas cost rate. You'll see this in many jurisdictions referred to as a PGA, or purchase gas adjustment. But this order would similarly set up the docket, assign a hearing examiner, allow for temporary rates subject to refund to go into effect on November 1st, and direct the utility to publish notice of the filing and of the intervention period. I want to thank Mr. Willard for putting the draft order together, and the company does urge acceptance of proposed order 9119.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Willard.
As Mr. O'Brien said, this proposed increase from 0.818 per CCF to 1.023 under certain rate schedules, and another increase for other different rate schedules. And then there's a couple of decreases as well proposed. Again, these sought to become effective November 1st, subject to refund following the hearing examiner's work on the case. Interventions required by October 31st, et cetera. We think the order covers everything, and the attached notice covers everything. And we would ask the Commission to approve order number 9119.
Thanks, Mr. Willard. Mr. Slater.
Mr. Chair, we have no objection. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioners.
Move we adopt order number 9119 as presented.
Second.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Oh, okay.
Any other ayes?
Aye.
How about Commissioner Correa? You voting on this one?
Yeah, twice, yes.
That's another aye. Okay, is there anybody opposed?
We only need three.
No abstentions. The motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, as I think I was saying, there's nothing on the hearing schedule. Is there anyone here from the public that wishes to make public comment on any topic, or anything but the NFL and the NASCAR or whatever's going on? Okay, I don't see anybody in the public coming forward. And we do have our executive director has got something of some importance on our calendar, so thank you, Mr. Executive Director.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, thank you again for the opportunity to address you on this wonderful short commission meeting day. I know you were trying for the record, but I'm going to try and figure out a way to not let anybody beat the record. So just be alerted to the fact that I'm going to keep you here for a while. I would ask Mr. Hardigan to introduce the guest that he has here at the commission meeting today.
Thank you, Mr. Howard. Commissioners, many people believe that water is our most precious natural resource. The Nature Conservancy's mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. At this point, I'd like to introduce Mr. Richie Jones, who's State Director of the Delaware chapter of the Conservancy, and Jenny Egan to provide a brief overview of their work in Delaware.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for making time for us today, and thanks for that great introduction. We're here to just for informational purposes brief the Commission on a project that we think, we know is pretty innovative. We've got a slide deck that's coming up here, and it involves the Public Service Commission in ways that I'll explain in a minute. As soon as we can get the slides. Now, do you all see those slides on your? You get them on your screen, right?
No, we do not.
And are they in the full screen size, or I'm just making sure
Yeah,
that
we're
loaded.
trying to get there.
Loaded and ready to go. Y'all see that slide on your screen?
Yes, sir.
No, we see it here,
Yeah.
but we don't have it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Don't assume that we're technologically advanced.
Can you get that on their screens, or are we going to just go?
No, we'll just go from this.
Okay. Then you're going to have to take my word for what some of these slides say, because unless your eyes are a whole lot better than mine. So, absolutely.
Is this a PowerPoint presentation? What is this?
It is.
And is there no way to give a slideshow enlargement on this screen and take away the views of the commissioners?
Commissioner Gray, we can enlarge the slides on the screens. We will, however, stop live streaming. So if it's an either-or situation.
Oh, I understand. Okay, I understand now. Okay. Perfect. Okay.
And I wish I brought some hard copies. Give me a second. There's a chance that I may have a few, but I don't think I've got enough.
And since the topic is what it is, we're certainly in favor of streaming.
Oh, funny.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that.
Ms. Egan will tell you.
The topic is streaming, so we're right on it.
Yeah, we can work with this.
Yeah.
We can work with this. I've had a lot worse technological challenges, so let me start by saying, my name is Richie Jones.
There you go.
There you go. My name is Richie Jones, and I'm the Delaware State Director for the Nature Conservancy. And I like to start with this slide because it's the farm in Pennsylvania that I grew up on, just over the state line. And we have cattle there, and it's subject to conservation easement. So as kids, we played in that stream. And another significant thing about that stream is that it's probably the cleanest tributary to the city of Wilmington's drinking water. It flows into the Brandywine, and that Brandywine supplies 100% of Wilmington's drinking water. It's also under conservation easement, which kept that stream in the quality that it is today. So I spent first 18, 20 years of my career as a practicing lawyer in Wilmington. Came to the Nature Conservancy 5 years ago. And the Nature Conservancy is the world's largest environmental organization, operations in all 50 states and 70 countries. And we've been much more focused over time in how do we prove the value of nature, not just from a sort of aesthetic standpoint or a recreational standpoint, but what really value does it bring to people? And this water fund project, the Brandywine Christina Healthy Water Fund, is kind of an outcropping of that. So we can go to the next slide. The basic, this graphic illustrates the basic concept of a water fund, and it's downstream beneficiaries putting investments upstream, usually in conservation practices that return downstream benefits in terms of water quality improvements. If you go to the next slide, this is a map of the Nature Conservancy's water funds across the country, and if you see in the top of Latin America, there's a cluster of them, and that's because that's where they started. And there it was pretty simple because you had a water utility or you had a bottling plant, you had something downstream from pretty intact upstream system, national forest or state park or some national park. And the interventions that you had to do, conservation interventions, weren't that complicated. You'll notice that there are not a lot of them in the United States. And in fact, there's one on the East Coast, I think, on that map in South Carolina. So if we go to the next slide, this is the Brandywine-Christina watershed. And what this map shows is, 2005, the land use in the Brandywine-Christina. When I say the Brandywine-Christina, I'm talking about the Brandywine watershed, the red clay, the white clay, and the Christina, 4 separate sub-watersheds, if you will. The land use is roughly split between urban in the red, yellow is agriculture, and green is open space. Roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. This map illustrates how much more complex the situation is that we're trying to tackle with bringing that water fund model to our watershed. There's a lot of interventions. There's a lot of sources of pollution. And so how do you bring that relatively simple construct to a watershed like ours? The things about this is that the red areas, the urban areas, are subject to MS4, Clean Water Act regulations, have an obligation to improve the water quality in their areas. And the interventions at their disposal, the things that they can do in their geographic area, tend to be pretty darn expensive. The yellow areas, the agricultural areas, produce most of the impairments that are in the streams. So there's soil runoff that causes sediment loading, and there's also nutrient loading that comes from farms. Farms aren't subject to the Clean Water Act, so there's a little bit of a disconnect there. One of the intents of our project is how do we drive investment from urban areas to the agricultural areas, which tend to produce much better benefits at a much lower cost. So we go to the next slide. This is how the water fund construct comes together. The first sort of blue loop you see there is to align the capital that's already being spent in the watershed to improve water quality. There's municipalities, there are water companies, which is why I'm here, both public and private, and there are also foundations. There's been a lot of philanthropic money spent on conservation in the watershed that returns water quality benefits. So we take that sort of set of funding, if you will, pull it together, and then we strategically deploy it using the best technologies we have to tell us where the pollution sources are coming from. And pollution's kind of a dirty word, no pun intended. But what I mean by that is nutrient loading and sediment loading, which is what causes the streams in our watershed to be quote unquote impaired under the Clean Water Act. That's a standard. Impaired streams. The whole drive of the Clean Water Act is to clean those streams up. So the last loop, we strategically deploy the capital using best technologies, and then how do we make a sustainable funding vehicle out of that? That's the challenge we undertook with this project. If you can go to the next slide. William Penn Foundation in Philadelphia has underwritten the great majority of our work thus far, which is up to the creation of a business plan, which we finished in July. And we are now looking to them to fund the startup of this fund, of this vehicle. And I keep saying vehicle and fund, and just so you understand what that means, that would be one or two people that are working on getting a pipeline of projects, getting them brought to us, quantifying what reductions would result from the practices that we put down on the farms, getting contracts in place to put those reductions in, actually putting the reductions in, monitoring and measuring the impact, and then reporting back to the stakeholders and to folks like you who would be involved in deciding how, whether or not that funding is being used wisely, and to use your term, is used and useful. So we also have DuPont and Mount Cuba. Mount Cuba is a big funder of land protection in the area, and we all know it's now Dow DuPont, of course, but DuPont has provided some funding to help start up. The next slide, if we could. These are our kind of principal stakeholders, both municipalities and water purveyors. Newark and City of Wilmington obviously have both MS4 regulations as municipalities, but they're also water providers to their area. And then we all know Suez, Aqua, and Pennsylvania American on the Pennsylvania side. We've also been engaging them along the way. And one of the things that brings me here is to one of the things we heard from the public, the the private water purveyors, the ones that are subject to your jurisdiction and the PUC in Pennsylvania's jurisdiction. One of the things we heard from them is we need help making the case to the Public Service Commission that if we make investments like this, they really are used and useful. And they've also asked us to help with legislation that would make it clearer without, not usurping any jurisdiction, but to make it clear that these sort of projects would be something that could be considered used and useful if it met your all standard. So that's what we've kind of developed there. Suez has been a great partner. We've met with them at their North American offices too, and this fits well into sustainability efforts that they're doing across the board. So if we can go to the next slide. Big part of this too is regulatory buy-in, and obviously when we're talking about the Clean Water Act, we have to engage both the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection on the Pennsylvania side and DENREC on the Delaware side when we're talking about permitting. We have your logo. I hope that's still your logo. I borrowed it off the internet. But we're obviously interested in being able to make the business case to you that investments in watershed services are used and useful and return that justify some of that expense being passed on to ratepayers. And we're not here to do that today, but we're just here to inform you that that's sort of where some of this is headed. The next slide, if you could. This is some great mapping and modeling that University of Delaware did for us. This is actually Suez's withdrawal area, and it shows, this particular map shows sediment loading in the area. And generally the darker the area of the watershed, the more sediment that's coming off those areas. And if we flip to the next slide, this overlays the agriculture in that region. So you can see at the top of the watershed, that's where most of the farms are. That's also where a lot of the sediment loading's coming from. So that tells us that's where we would be directing our investment. And the next slide this is the whole watershed. But what this shows is William Penn Foundation has been investing millions of dollars over the last, it's going to be about 6 years by the time we get through the next cycle, in doing work, the exact kind of work we're talking about here, which is going on the farms and putting in ways of keeping the sediment and the nutrients on the farms. They've been paying for that with philanthropic capital. And so what we're trying to do is leverage that work and start to capture the value that that's having in the watershed and actually make it in a way that is quantifiable and we can make the business case to folks like you and the water companies and the municipalities. Next slide. Going a little deeper on that, these are the conservation organizations in Pennsylvania that William Penn's been funding and that we've been working with. They have the relationships with the farmers in both Pennsylvania and Delaware to get. We need those relationships to be able to bring the practices to those farms. The next slide. This shows just a little bit about what kind of practices we're really talking about. On the left, I'm pretty sure that project is in the is in the red clay, and I'm not positive about that, but you see where the cows are down in the stream. Cows obviously could be a source of cryptosporidium in addition to all that eroded bank right there. Goes right down into the stream. You have nutrient loading. You have dirt, sediment going into the stream. There's a before and after. That's the farm after the cows were fenced out, trees are planted, and that's the sort of practices we're talking about implementing. Again, pretty cost effective when compared to what the options that are available to the urbanized areas. And the other one is from a USDA depiction of the suite of practices that you can put on farms. There are things called grass waterways, riparian buffers or filter strips along the waterways. There's a whole bunch of different things, and each of those can be you can quantify from pretty sophisticated modeling how much sediments and how much nutrients those practices are actually removing, which allows us to then start to put a value on what these practices do. If we go to the next slide, just quickly, in general, on a farm, when we talk about going and putting that practice down, that blue area that you see I'll take the left side, about 70% of the funding that is used to put this practices on comes from the federal government, the USDA, through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. Some of the little green and red lines are some state-level funding, and this is just Pennsylvania right here. But there's a 30% gap in funding, and that's been filled by philanthropic in the past. We're looking to both fill that funding gap and also take credit for, if you will, or put a value on that 30% of uplift that we're getting above the practices that are already being put on. And so that's the value that we're looking at capturing. And the next slide shows how we're looking at rolling this out. Right now, the kind of light blue that you see in those graphs, that's the current rate of implementation of what we call whole farm plans, the current rate of how many farms are being treated, if you will, that the practices are going on. And the dark blue is what we project to be the acceleration through the water fund. So we start out small with a couple farms a year in the first 3 years, and that's to work out issues like with DNREC and the Environmental Protection Agency in Pennsylvania. How are we going to get credit for the municipalities for this work? Let's say we put these practices down on the farm. Here's what we say is going to be the reduction. Can we take that and get credit for Kennett Square for their municipal stormwater because it's upstream from them? Right now, the first test case we have is with the City of Newark, and using some DuPont money and City of Newark money, we're working with DNREC on putting some practices down on a farm in Newark's watershed and asking DNREC what can they get credit for, what can Newark get credit for towards their MS4 permit. And so if you go to the next slide, and you're not going to be able to read this, I'm sorry, but this is our financial plan, and that yellow line shows the number of farms we're looking at implementing. A couple of takeaways here. The top line, which you can't see again, I'm sorry, shows what we have budgeted for the startup of the fund, for the staffing, and then we also have project capital. There's an assumption in here that we're going to attract what we call impact capital to this project. Impact capital is it takes the place of philanthropic capital. It's investors that want to see both a social benefit and a financial return on their investment, or they're willing to take less of a financial return in exchange for that social benefit. In this case, an improvement in water quality, maybe some policy developments that result from this whole model. Now I'm going to jump into something that's a little different, but right on the top line, it does say $1.5 million in capital. That's sort of our baseline right there. There's also lines in there for water companies investment. As you probably know, Suez is currently making some upstream investment. The City of Wilmington's making upstream investment. So is the City of Newark. Pretty small, very small investments, $40,000, $50,000 a year. That could treat about one farm a year for each of them. We want to see them over time be able to increase that investment. So that's just a couple takeaways from that slide. You just have to take my word for that's what the numbers say there. And then if we can go to the next slide. In July, we were awarded a very large USDA grant. There are 32 of them awarded across the country. This was one of those 32, is one of the larger of them. And this is the grant was actually awarded to a company called I2 Capital. That's the red little upside down I and 2, which stands for Impact Investment, 2 I's. They got the grant to build what's called a pay for success model around our water fund. So if you go to the next slide, and again, it's going to be probably a little difficult to see, but this is an overview of the transaction that we're trying to arrange. We go out and get some impact investors. We're putting a $10 million target on that raise, on the top green box. Those impact investors put their $10 million in the water fund. We use that to pay the blue box of conservation partners to put all these practices on the farms. There's a set of beneficiaries that include the water purveyors and the municipalities. We equitably apportion the cost of that, the work across those beneficiaries, and then there's a performance metric. So in the beginning of this transaction, the beneficiaries agree that if we hit certain performance metrics, they'll repay that front-end investment with a modest rate of return. We're talking about 2%, something like that, real low-cost capital, but a return. And so the impact investors in that top green box are taking the risk that this might not work, right? And the reason they're doing that is because there may be skepticism in this body about whether we're actually going to be able to do what we say we're going to do. There may be skepticism at the municipal level, at DEP. So we set a performance metric that's agreed to by all the parties, hopefully the regulatory parties as well. And we put this transaction together, bringing capital. This is modeled after a very similar transaction in Washington, D.C. It's called an environmental impact bond. If you go to the next slide, this is our project team. On the left side, you can see the conservation supply team. That's Jenny and I. And Jeff Larson is our lawyer from TNC, the Nature Conservancy. There's also the demand side, which is working with the municipalities and water companies and regulators. We've got a really high-powered team there. The guy at the top, Eric Letzinger, did the D.C. water bond. Rob Wallace was the head of government relations for GE Energy for 20 years. Before that, he was the lead staffer on Senate Energy Committee. Matt McKenna was Undersecretary of Agriculture. On the conservation finance side, Ashley Allen's the founder of IT Capital, and she's got. I'm having trouble reading it myself. The NatureVest team from the Nature Conservancy. We have an internal impact investment firm in the Nature Conservancy. So those folks are working on putting together the financing, bringing in that capital, that $10 million. I'm glad they have that job. That's harder than my job, I think. And then we have another team that is charged with working amongst the various constituents to set the performance metric. And it's pretty high-tech stuff. It's there are people that make a living out of figuring out how to measure the impact in a way that is pretty certain. So that's our team. If you can go to the next slide. This is what Jenny and I are trying to do, which is build the pipeline of supply for the fund. Next slide. I'll just zip through these. This is demand side activities, and as you can see, maybe you can't see, I'm having trouble seeing. This is the setting of the metrics, and there's a verification and making sure that the metrics actually work. Next slide. And we're never going to read this. I'll just tell you about the DC impact bond because it was pretty neat. DC Water floated $1 billion or $2 billion, I don't know what it was, bond to address their combined sewer overflow problem in the district. And they were approached by a foundation and Goldman Sachs, and this was from an impact investment standpoint. That group said, hey, we can help you address your combined sewer overflow using nature-based solutions, green infrastructure in the district. But we understand that you might not believe that that's going to work. So we'll take the front-end risk. And Goldman and Calvert Foundation put up, I think it was $25 million, to put out green infrastructure in the district. The DC Water only has to repay that money if they successfully reduce, those projects successfully reduce flow in a pipe by a certain amount. And so that's the construct. We're trying to take that construct and move it out into the country, if you will. Next slide. I'm not going to spend any more of your time on the metric, but this is one for Lake Tahoe. It's a pretty sophisticated process that they go through to build the measurement. In the DC example, it was really simple. It was like, did you reduce flow by X with a little flow meter in a pipe? It's not that simple in our watershed, and that's why we have these professionals. Next slide is. So that's the sort of the big thing. And when I showed you the $1.5 million investment in the beginning, this transaction is looking at bringing in $10 million or more. So how does the Public Service Commission fit in? They fit in one of two ways. One is we want to be able to convince you as a body that the investments that companies like Suez are making, if they do make them, are useful. And we want your feedback on what sort of information we would need, not now, but over time, to make that case. Secondly, we would like you to, and not today, but over time, entertain the concept. Is there a way that we could get Suez to be able to participate in a pay-for-success transaction like this? Not being the only obligor on there, but together with a group of municipalities, some other water companies, City of Wilmington, City of Newark, if that was equitably portioned, can you work through with us how that might work? And I'm putting that concept out. It might not work. It might not. Maybe it won't work. But I think that's going to be a key element to the success of this much larger vision. And I'll just close by saying that no one's done this. No one's done this. That's why the USDA gave us the money that they did to build this transaction. We presented to a whole group of conservation finance professionals 2 weeks ago in D.C. Everybody's really excited about it. We're trying to create a model that is, I think, really necessary because we have to, we have to clean up our waterways, and we can do it in a cost-effective way. This presents that pathway to do that. Again, we really appreciate your time. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them, either now or over the phone or any way you want to reach out. But I hope that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what's a little bit of a complicated project. But thank you for your time. And do you have any questions?
Mr. Slater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not going to ask questions. I'm just going to make a few comments. For those of you that may know, I have a pretty extensive history of background in agriculture. So first, I just wanted to mention that our surface water is currently clean and meets all the state and federal guidelines. So it's not a detriment to public health. There was a comment made on most of the impediments coming from agriculture. That may actually be the case here. But most of that is coming from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has no nutrient management plan, which Delaware's had for 15 years. And actually, Delaware is leading the nation with their nutrient management plan. In addition to that, not only do most farms, almost all farms, have no nutrient management plan, they have no nutrient management inspectors. So I appreciate clean drinking water and making the water cleaner, but I want to point out that this starts in Pennsylvania. This does not start in Delaware. And in order to get the agricultural farms on board, Pennsylvania needs to do more. So if it is the will of this commission at some point in the future or the legislature, I would hope that we would first send letters to Pennsylvania. I'm willing to do it. I'm sure the Nature Conservancy is, and I hope that the Public Service Commission would be as well, to ask them to have a nutrient management plan. Because without a nutrient management plan, there's slides that you have that show that you have the cows by the stream. You're not going to see that here. You are going to see that in Pennsylvania quite often, and it's all because they don't have a nutrient management plan or inspectors. And so, before we spend Delaware ratepayer dollars cleaning up Pennsylvania's issue, perhaps we should ask. Well, I would emphatically suggest that we ask Pennsylvania to clean up their mess first before we have to go up there and clean up their mess for them.
Well, I think that I don't. Richie can speak for himself. I mean, I would agree with you, but from my perspective, used to live in Wilmington. That water coming down that stream, I don't think you were talking about that water when you made the comment that it's clean. There's a lot of problems with the Brandywine River, which flows through the city of Wilmington, and there's a lot of city of Wilmington problems that they haven't fixed with respect to sewer and water discharge. I mean, there's a lot of issues in Delaware, not on the farm. And I think part of this concept is to show the benefit to the city of Wilmington and Newcastle County by doing projects that aren't in Delaware. And they're going to try to prove that they're going to have a financial impact that's positive, that they can actually pay 2% interest on that. They're going to try to find people who are going to make the payments on the capital on the 2%. So I think it's perhaps we will have to lead Pennsylvania or kick them maybe. I don't know what the proper term would be, but I just think it's great that we're discussing this, and we'll see what happens in the future. But anybody else have any questions? Mr. Gregg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm not sure which hat to put on, my engineering hat, my economic development for the city of Wilmington hat, or my ratepayer hat. So let me start at the ratepayer. I guess as I'm listening and I'm thinking through this engineering aspects of what you're attempting to achieve, it's a little confounding to me to imagine that you're going to be able to draw a scope boundary around a watershed because of the dynamic nature of municipalities giving permits for construction. And as you're cleaning on the one end, things are getting dirtier on the other. So I'm more interested to see what kind of performance metrics emerge, what kind of business case, what value proposition the water company is bringing, and what is it that is communicated to the ratepayer who may see some type of impact on their bill as a consequence of these investments that we have to set rates for at the Utility Commission. So those are some of the concerns that come to mind. I know Wilmington Municipal has a big project to separate the overflow from the sewerage. And they're using a green technique in South Wilmington by creating kind of a lake and a park that will take that water flow and reduce the burden on sewage treatment. I think on the sewage treatment side, as you mentioned, Blue Plains, you can draw a scope around pipe flows, around capacity of the treatment required. You can get a better value proposition on that side of the equation, but I'd need to understand a lot more parameters and facets and aspects in order to get a comfort level that explaining this type of a concept to a ratepayer is going to feel comfortable. Because they're going to say, well, is that farm investment really going to impact the water that I'm drinking? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my 2 cents. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, to the public advocate's point, there, at least under the Clean Water Act, in the Brandywine Christina, the great majority of streams are what they call impaired. They don't meet the Clean Water Act standard from nutrient loading and sediment loading. It's just, we have, and bacteria. So, and we've had, the cryptosporidium outbreak that we had at the Suez plant. I mean, I agree with you that Delaware is ahead on the farm management practices. But I also don't want to leave the impression that we're asking Delaware to shoulder all the burden. First of all, we have that 70% sort of threshold that I showed you, that from federal funding. But we also have this whole construct is dependent on getting the Pennsylvania municipalities to pay a large share of what would happen, of the interventions that would go on. So there's already an apportionment. And we do, and it's a very common reaction is, why are we sending our money to Pennsylvania? But we do have the water coming back to us, and I think it's more a question of how do we equitably apportion it's either equitable apportionment or it's also where do we have the most bang for our buck? And if it happens to be in Pennsylvania, well then let's figure out a way to put it there. Because that'll have the biggest impact. Just a couple thoughts sort of back.
So if I can just have a second. So, I mean, my comment would be that surface water is, you can drink the water that Suez provides, which is kind of my
coming out of the plant.
Yes. Yeah. Which is kind of my point. I don't want people to think that they should fear the Suez water. Not that everything is clean. I get that. I guess a large part of my point is the fact that if Pennsylvania farms don't change, nothing else will change. And us trying to change Pennsylvania farms, I think, is the wrong tactic because Pennsylvania needs to change themselves. We're 15 years ahead of them. Mm-hmm. I wish my excuse was on this because I think he'd be pretty happy right now. But they have to change their practices first. And that was the one thing I was missing from the slide was that I didn't see their Department of Agriculture, because if they don't get involved and if they don't change on their side, it doesn't matter what we're going to do. And then we're throwing good ratepayer money into a state that is not our own, and we can't be the police for Pennsylvania. That's my concern, that we would end up being the police for Pennsylvania if they don't change themselves.
So I'd just say, I'm not sure it's we don't need to debate it now, but I'm not sure it's an either-or proposition. What I'm trying to say is we don't have to do it all, but we can be part of the solution as opposed to being the whole solution. And maybe we can, we can affect change, but in a way that's equitable. And then, Commissioner Gray, to your point, you're right. I mean, it's a big nut to crack. What we've seen so far is that I think one way to look at it is this is if you take Suez or the city of Newark, this is the principal asset. It's the water column. It is what we're going to rely on way into the future, hopefully, for our drinking water, which is vital. So how do we protect the long-term security of that asset? But to your point, like, how do you control sort of the environment? Like, how are you going to draw a boundary around it and really know that you're going to get value? And that's what the modeling's for. So that's why we have the professionals that we do. There's also the sort of business case at the plant, right? So if we reduce sediments by 10%, what's that reduction in operating costs? What's that, filtration costs, electricity, that sort of thing? And we're going to need to depend on the water utility to do that analysis, to give us that information, because we don't have that, right? So we can say, look, we'll reduce it 10%, whatever it is, going in. You need to tell us what that equates to. And then there's also the kind of the public health risk of something like a crypto outbreak or an algae bloom in a reservoir, which Suez doesn't have reservoirs, but that there's that aspect too that we have to, that I would argue is something we need to keep in mind as well.
Commissioner Correa.
In one slide, I saw that there's a bond issue for $25 million at 3.45%. There are revolving funds for clean water in Delaware.
Yeah.
And they also supply, they also give you some grants,
Yes.
and they structure
Yes.
it properly.
Yeah.
Have you talked to the Clean Water Advisory Council?
We have, and so
Okay.
and there's a really interesting. I think the way that may fit in is with, let's take the city of Newark or city of Wilmington. If they make this investment, one way that on the back end that they could, the takeout when they need to pay the investors back, they could take out a Clean Water Revolving Fund loan at a low interest. There's also, for Pennsylvania, there are USDA rural development funds that tend to be really low interest and sometimes half grant money. So there's some really interesting financial arrangements that can be made. There could be, at some point, a direct investment by using state clean water revolving funds into the fund, if that was sort of proven out. One thing that's neat about the pay-for-success model, it's a risk shifting, right? So the investor's willing to take the risk that this isn't going to work. But the idea is that once you go through a cycle and it does work, if it does work, then you have these direct transactions. You don't need that investor anymore to stand in there because they have now seen that it works, and the beneficiary can go directly to a service provider to get those benefits. And in that instance, I think you'd have a lot more faith in doing something like a Clean Water Revolving Fund loan.
So, and I presume that they are tax-exempt bonds, right? Because the interest rate of 3.45 sounds higher, very high to me,
Yeah.
for tax-exempt bonds.
First of all, your eyes are much better than mine. But secondly, there was a sliding scale.
Course, yeah.
So and that's a whole other interesting concept. So if you overperform, in that case, there's a premium. If you underperform, the downside's limited. There's also it's not really that germane, but there's ways that the downside can be guaranteed for the investor. Sometimes the foundation will say, we'll guarantee 75% of the risk, so that investors only stand to lose $2.5 million, and so that we'll be looking at that as well.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, Delaware was lucky in that the state Senate and House and the governor supported the nutrient management program, which was put together, I guess, by the secretary, who did a great job. And of course, Delaware was also fortunate because we had a great president pro tem who was an agricultural leader. So I think we had someone in leadership who understood the issues and knew it could work, and it's what got through. Drew's grandfather being the one I'm talking about. So we really appreciate your briefing on this topic. It sounds exciting, and we wish you much success, obviously, because it's going to endure to our benefit. And we look forward to your innovations and your legal theories with respect to recovery. Best wishes. Any
Thank
other
you very
questions?
much. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Richie, Jenny, appreciate you being here and sharing with us. It certainly has been an intellectual discussion, probably way over my head at this point, but we've talked about streaming, and I think we've been talking about video streaming. We've been talking about watershed cleanup, and the only thing this really reminds me of is that September 28th is National Drink Beer Day.
Yeah.
So in case any of you want to know, while you're out watching the parade of NASCAR vehicles riding up and down 13 at 5 o'clock tonight, feel free to drink a beer on National Drink a Beer Day.
Yep.
Just one day?
Just
Yes,
one
just
day.
one day.
You got to get it all in one day.
Why didn't you pass out water?
Our next meeting is on October 17th, and we're going back to a Tuesday schedule. Thank
Thank you
you.
all very much for being present. The meeting is adjourned. I want to go say thank you to Richard.